Friends, greetings from Los Angeles, California. Welcome to another session of IRMAN Talks. I'm your moderator for today's session. My name is Rajneesh Puri, and I'm a graduate of PRM 8587. This session is scheduled to last for about an hour. While I'll do my best to get the most out of our guest today, I encourage you to send questions our way via chat or otherwise. And towards the end of the session, we'll devote some time to answer any questions. Today's topic is a portfolio then a ladder on making meaningful life and career choices. It's a fascinating topic, and in my view, there is no better person than our guest today to comment on this subject. Before we begin our conversation, I would like to share some background about our guest. Our guest today has a distinguished global career spanning across US, Europe, Asia over a 37-year period since graduating with honors from IRMA in 1987. Right after leaving IRMA, he joined APDDCF to market Vijaya butter and related products in Western India. Though I think he was highly successful in that role, his true calling was in journalism, which led him to jump ship and join the Economic Times as a staff reporter. At the Times, one of his accomplishments was to launch the ET Squire, which at the time was the first all-color weekend edition section of any business paper in India. Friends, that was just the beginning of a remarkable career that followed in the field of journalism, publishing, and much more. He moved to the US to earn a master's degree in journalism from Indiana University, following which he launched his journalism career in the US by joining the Dayton Daily News as a staff reporter. In a very short period of time, he was recruited by the Wall Street Journal as a reporter where he covered global media, technology, and consumer products. His meteoric rise at the Wall Street Journal is amazing. He was promoted from a reporter to the role of a deputy national editor of the paper's American edition, later a managing editor and the editor of the Wall Street Journal Europe. Among many other things, his contributions to the paper during the post 9/11 period played a significant role in his rise at the journal. Later, one of the special accomplishments of this guest was the founding of Mint, which I understand even today is the second largest business newspaper. HT Media recruited him for this assignment. As if that was not enough, it was the Washington Post, another reputable publication in the US, that recruited him subsequently as managing editor of the paper's digital edition. Later, taking a slight detour from conventional journalism, he was hired by a News Corporation to serve as Senior Vice President of Growth and Strategy, where he helped the media group cultivate new revenue opportunities, especially in Asia. Following his tenure at News Corp, once again, he was hired as President and Chief Executive Officer of Gizmodo Media Group, an affiliate of Univision, where he managed a portfolio of several journalism brands. Later, he joined Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, becoming a professor of professional practice and director at the school's Knight Bagehot Fellowship Program. Today, he's the leader global publishing at The McKinsey, a role he took over in 2020. He serves on several nonprofit boards, is a frequent and highly sought-after speaker on a broad range of topics pertaining to media, publishing, and journalism. Among his many other honors, he was appointed to the board of trustees of the Wikimedia Foundation. He is also one of the young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Friends, I am pleased, honored, and privileged to have a conversation with my fellow batchmate of PRM 6, a dear friend, on multiple occasions a mentor, the very distinguished and highly accomplished Raju Narisetti, who joins us from New York City. Hello, Raju.
Hi, Rajneesh. Normally inflation is always bad news, except when you're being introduced so generously. Thank you. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It feels a little strange to be a speaker in part because if I just look around here, what Meenu and Raja, Dinesh, and Dheeraj and you have all accomplished, any one of us could be the featured speaker, I suppose. But thank you, and looking forward to chatting.
Great. Welcome again. Uh, so let's get right into the subject matter today. Raju, most professionals typically tend to stay long term with their employers. Uh, if you examine the careers of many people, generally there'll be a few platforms they would be at. In many cases, only one growing in the ranks within their organization. You, on the other hand, are a special case, have held over 10 positions, each very unique and special. And I would say with an average of about 3, 4 years at every platform. Um, in other words, you chose a portfolio and not a ladder. So my question to you is sort of a blended question. Why this approach? Was it always planned this way? How did it really come about?
Well, Rajnish, it could also be that I can't hold a job, right? Just kidding. Most of these have been conscious choices, but it wasn't necessarily the intent when I started off. My first job at the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones lasted 14 years. But I think I was a bit spoiled by that first US journalism role of a major role. I mean, I was at the Dayton Daily News for a little while. Because what happens at the Wall Street Journal is if you're doing a particular beat or an assignment well, typically in about 18 months, somebody will tap you on the shoulder and says that, look, we've been looking at what you've been doing. Would you be interested in doing this? Because right now we have a need there. We feel like you might be good for that. And I think there's a tendency among people to not want to jump at new things because you build up an expertise and you're comfortable in what you're doing and you're getting good at something. By nature, I think I was more inclined to say, that sounds interesting and new, and let me try my hand. So I would automatically say yes to those things. So in my 14 years, even though if you look at it, it feels like I've spent 14 years in a same company, I had like 7 different opportunities.
Right.
So I think that just gave me, the confidence to take on new things, and B, this kind of, it's a bit of an adrenaline high where you feel like, hey, I have taken something new and I've done pretty well at it, which means that the next time something comes along, I could do it. I'll also tie this back to IRMA a little bit, Rajneesh. I think when most of us got to IRMA in 85, we were really boys and girls, right? Meaning that we first time living away from perhaps even the city you were born in, first time living away from home, all of that. And then 2 years at IRMA, I think it turned us all into men and women, right? But there's that, obviously there's that growth that came about that. But IRMA also, because between the fieldwork, between the MTSs, between subjects that we never really took before or had to apply theoretical understanding to very practical things, I think it made us a few things, right? It made us, at least in my case, and I can speak for some of you here as well, I think it made us more confident, a bit more resilient, right? Because when you ended up in fieldwork or in a village or MTS, you literally didn't know what to expect, right? And you somehow made it work. It made us, I think it gave us all a sense of we can deal with complexity and uncertainty, right?
Mm-hmm.
It also paired us with almost randomly, right? We could almost never choose who we would have an MTS with, right? In my case, there was an extra benefit, and unintentional, by the way, that I got paired up with like also women, right? And my first MTS was with Bharti Ponala. My second one was Jyoti Singh. Jyoti is a good friend. Bharti, we have lost touch with as a group, but it also made you like able to deal with like different people, in this case, gender, obviously, but also like just work with like people that who are not like you or you didn't know them. I think all of those kind of just gave me this inherent belief that if something new and uncertain is coming, you know what, let me try it. It might be fun. And the more I did it, the more I felt like I'm actually, pretty good at this. And over time, it became a bit of a way how I chose the next opportunity. I think you and I have talked about this a little bit before, but over time, I began kind of asking a fairly simple sounding question. And when a new opportunity came up, which is, when is the last time I did something for the first time? Meaning that somebody would come and offer me something, and I would say, I think I can do that job because I've done a few things that will help me do the job. But that particular job is also something I've never done before. Right? And that prism has really helped me kind of take on new things, but take it on in a way that also makes me go into a new job with some confidence that I can do this because I have some background, but also a fair bit of like what I would call a learning mindset, saying that I don't know a lot of aspects of this job. And it applies literally in every job. Let's take the McKinsey role I'm in now, right? For 30 some years, I've been in B2C journalism and B2C communication, right? Meaning that I work at a large platform, we are communicating to individuals. McKinsey came and said, look, we need some help on a few things. We think your background and all of that. And I was like, yeah, I think I can do it. But guess what? I had never done B2B publishing ever in my life. And I was like, even if I don't succeed in this role, for however long I do this, I'll pick up one more thing I didn't know before. So it's been a good way for me to assess opportunities and jump at things. We can talk about like, there are always costs to moving around, right? I mean, no question about it. So there are some downsides to it as well. But overall, that's been the reason to think of any job as a terminal job. Meaning, if you look back at some of the roles I've done, right? Managing editor, Wall Street Journal Digital, senior vice president strategy at News Corp, professor at Columbia Journalism School, the best journalism school in the world. For a lot of people, these are terminal jobs, meaning you go there and that's the job you want to do for the rest of your life, right? Totally nothing wrong in that. In my case, I felt like the moment you think that job is going to be a terminal job, I think you make very suboptimal choices. You first of all want to hang on to the job, right? Because you want to retire from there. B, I think you stop learning. You feel like, you feel more and more reliant on expertise that I can do this, so that like hubris and confidence kind of blend in together. And I don't think you over time become as good as you should be in that role if a new person is in that role, right? So in a way, I think all these have helped me think about my career as a bit of a curation of experiences, work experiences, and each one layers on top of the other. And I feel like every time something new comes, I can really reflect back and learn from all of the things I've done and apply that to the new role. Look, I'm 58, right? I'm one of the younger people in our batch, as some of you know. But I'm also like, 58. It's not like I'm young anymore. But when Kamala Harris can run for presidency at 59, I feel like I've got another 10, 15 years of interesting things to do in my life, right? So I'm not looking at things as like getting towards the end of something. I'm always looking at this one adds one more thing to me or my capabilities or my portfolio, and it'll help me with whatever the next thing is. Not that I'm looking to move, but it's just kind of that mindset is one of like being open to trying new things.
Great. I will come back to that question about, how many years you have left, but let's ask as a follow-up to this question here. So I know that, in your career, you have actually applied for only two jobs, the APDDCF job as you graduated from IRMA, and the next one that I know of is applying for the prestigious summer internship at the Wall Street Journal. Everything else to my knowledge, you were recruited by the companies. Okay, which is great. But my question to you is, uh, when did you know, when you were recruited and you were about to make the change? When did you know that you have completed your mission at the then current role and you were ready for the move? And in making that move, given that you were a sought after candidate, what did you seek in that next opportunity that that you knew that you're not necessarily looking for a change? Somebody else is recruiting you, but it's different when one is seeking a job. It's very different when an employer is seeking you. So how did you blend that to make sure that the opportunity that is being offered to you is the right one for you, and would you accept or not? What went through your mind in accepting a change that came your way?
I mean, if I had to give one advice about changing jobs, I would say that the best time to change jobs is when you're happy with your current job, because
Hmm.
then you make very rational decisions about the next opportunity. But if you wait until you're unhappy and miserable, you tend to jump at the first thing that seems like a way out, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. So in a lot of times, to answer your question, if you feel like you've finished something, it feels like then you probably stayed in the job a little too long. Meaning that
Hmm.
I've always like, when a new opportunity has come, it's always been a difficult choice to make because I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. I've often, I mean, over time, I became a manager and a leader and hired people, and it's always tough to leave the people that you've kind of created a team. The
Hmm.
organization is treating you well, you're having impact. But honestly, that's when you make very rational choices about why do I want to do something else. Look, all of us, and it varies, by the way, Rajneesh, as you know this well, in our kind of what where we are in our life, right? When, for example, for I have two daughters, and for a while I could up and move them, right?
Yeah.
There came a point of time when I told them like they had lived in 4 continents, 5 cities in their first 12 years, right? So then
Hmm.
when we moved back to New York, this was 2013, 2014, I told both of them that until you finish high school, right, we're not moving again, right? So
Hmm.
that kind of defines like then if an
Sure.
opportunity comes, you're like, okay, sounds great, but I've committed to on my personal side not to disrupt my kids like high school and
Hmm.
all of that, right? So there could be, and there sometimes it could be money, right? Sometimes
Right.
you do something just because in India, this is fairly common, less so in the US. In India, I've seen, because I have a team in India, I've seen people get offers that are 50% more salary, right?
Hmm.
Very hard sometimes then to kind of turn that down because even if you are happy with your job, your raises or increments, as you call in India, maybe, 10, I mean, India, it's double digits. In the US, as you know, it's like sometimes 2, 3, 4%.
Yeah.
So you could make that calculation.
Hmm.
Sometimes people feel like, look, people above me are not going to change anytime soon. So that other role is offering me a title,
Hmm.
and the title is what like will place me. I move from X to Y category, and everybody else after that will look at me at that category, right? So there are
Hmm.
lots of ways to think about it. In my case, as you are right in the sense that, by the way, even APDDCF was campus recruitment, right? So they choose. You can apply, but they don't have to call you for an interview, right?
Sure. Sure.
It was Harish Rao, Praveen Agarwal,
And yes.
Ranjani Krishnan, and me who got selected by APDDCF at that time, right?
Right.
In campus recruitment. The
Right.
joy of campus recruitment, Rajesh, you knows that if you get selected on day one, you're the next 2 weeks you're
Done.
a happy camper, right?
That's
You're
right.
not
That's
thinking
right.
about anything.
Yeah.
Um, so when opportunities have come, it has been whether it's good, whether it's obviously you want to measure, are you like getting maybe more money, are you getting a different title? But like I said, for me it has always been, am I going to do something new for the first
Okay.
time, right? And it's a really, by the way, it's a very simple sounding question, but if you ask that, it's actually the answers are fairly profound, right? Because it's basically allowing you to evaluate an opportunity, setting aside all the usual things, money,
Mhm.
title, and all that.
Right.
So that's been a very good way. And by the way, if you ever leave an organization in anger, that means that the organization has won. right? You should always leave in like sadness and some amount of joy about what you've built.
Sure.
But the other thing also and this perhaps applies, and I think Minu and others who have built organizations and have created teams fully understand this. I mean, part of our responsibility to an organization is, as Jonas Salk would put it, have we been good ancestors? Meaning that are we leaving behind teams and leadership in a better place than we inherited it, right? Because we owe it to that organization. It has treated you well, paid you well, given you an opportunity. So when you're leaving, it can't be that it's in a much worse place than when you came in, right? So that means you've groomed succession planning, you've like created a bench. On that front, I have always believed that whether somebody asks me or not, in the first like literally 6 months of joining something, I have started grooming people to replace me in case that needs to happen. Not because I'm leaving, but and that's a very conscious thing I've done. So you also feel good when you leave an organization that it's in a better place, and that's because of you. You've built a team, you've trained people to do good things with it. So there's a different kind of that also helps you kind of make the decision to move on. I'll give you a very concrete example. I left Mint relatively shortly. I mean, not that long after I formed.
Yeah.
But it was also because Sukumar, who later ran it, Sukumar Ranganathan, who's now the editor of Hindustan Times, was my deputy at Mint.
Okay.
And about a year and a half into it, I felt like he was ready to actually take my job. And the original plan was that I would move to the parent company and do something else at HT Media. But this was like 2012, there's a significant economic downturn in India. And I could have stayed back and run Mint for longer, but I had already committed to making Sukumar my successor.
Sure.
So I was like, you know what? It's good for the organization that if they do it, and then I went on to do other things.
Okay.
So I think that's also a good way to think about when is the right time to leave. If you feel like your team is actually ready to kind of take on and you can leave it in good hands.
Right.
It's also another like prism that you can use to make that decision.
Okay. I want to pick up on the Mint role that you were there for a short term. Your transition from Wall Street Journal Europe to Mint. Share with our audience, what was the mindset? How did you make that decision? Because from where I see, all of these choices that you've made are, very rational. You had this new opportunity, but transitioning from Wall Street Journal Europe as its managing editor to going and founding a new product, like that was a huge leap of faith. I would like to know, what was your mindset? How did you walk away from something so special to doing something that has never been tried before? Yes, I know you rely on that line, when is the last time you did something for the first time? But this was something very different. I'd like to have you share with our audience, what made you decide that.
Yeah, I would say that was one of the hardest decisions I made. I remember I was based in Europe, running Wall Street Journal Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I was the head of the Wall Street Journal Europe and had a global role. I was the youngest and the only person of color on the global masthead in the history of the Wall Street Journal. In many ways, I was probably seen as a kind of a rising star with a bright future at the journal because of that. I remember like coming and after making a decision, coming to New York to tell my boss, and after telling him, we were downtown at that time and sitting on a bench by the Hudson River and literally crying after that decision, right? Because it was so hard to make. Two reasons, Rajneesh. One was that my parents were living in India at that time still, right? And I would visit India almost once a year.
Yeah.
And every time I would visit India, I would get really upset at the quality of business journalism in India. I would pick up papers, Economic Times, Business Standard, Business Line, Financial Express were the four papers that were there. They've been there for a while. I would, I would pick them up when I would visit Hyderabad, and I would get really annoyed because I would be like, I don't understand what I'm reading, because they would not give you any context. They would expect you to know what happened until yesterday. They didn't care about tomorrow. They will just tell you what happened today, right? And I would pick up and it would be full of acronyms. It would be full of jargon. It will act like you should know this and won't explain anything. And I would get really annoyed about it. And I would tell myself, a billion people deserve better products than these, right? So that was the personal level. Professionally, this was 2005, 2006. I was starting to say very publicly, including in Dow Jones, my organization, that the future or the center of gravity of business journalism needs to shift to China and India and other places, because that's where things are happening, right? China was really kind of making a big difference in global business. And I was saying, but we are not still covering North America, Western Europe, and that's about it. We were not really covering other parts very well. And I would say this very publicly. Dow Jones at that time was not owned by Rupert Murdoch and News Corp. It was a standalone company. It wasn't doing financially that well. And the CEO would say, totally agree with you, Raju, but we don't have the resources to do anything more than what we're doing, right? So that was the reality of it. But I would say this publicly as well. And the CEO of HT Media at that time, Rajiv Verma, had heard me or read about it somewhere. And they reached out and said, look, we saw you talk about this. We have been thinking about doing a business paper to compete with, Economic Times and others. Would you like to do it? So I literally ended up, I remember talking to my, Kim, my then wife, and I literally ended up putting my career where my mouth was, right? And I said, like, okay, let me go try this. The other context at that time, and it may be a little harder for some of the younger IRMANs here, you could spend a very successful career in the late in 2000, early 2000s. The startup culture wasn't really there yet, right? It was still very traditional organization. So you could spend a very successful career and never create something, meaning you could have a good job at a big company and do fine. So the opportunity of like creating something from the scratch was also very enticing. The India piece of it, I must be honest here. The India piece of it was great, but accidental. Meaning, if somebody had come and told me almost the same thing, but said like, "Do you want to start a paper in Brazil?" If I thought I could do it, I would have gone and done it. Right? India was just a bonus because I thought I knew the country, right? Which, by the way, I discovered I didn't after 20 years when I went back. So all those led to the decision. And this is where my earlier reference to sometimes these decisions come at a cost, right? In my case, like I said, Dow Jones was not doing well at that time. It was a public company, but they would give you a lot of shares. So on paper, I had like a ridiculous amount of shares that were not worth anything because the Dow Jones, the company, was not doing well. But when I left, because this was restricted stock, you give all the shares back when you leave, right? On your own. So a year after I left, Rupert Murdoch comes and buys the shares for $60 a share, like literally 2 times the price. So had I stayed, by the way, just, if you can never revisit the past. Had I stayed, I would have been significantly more richer than I ever have been in my life, right? But honestly, yes, you could think of it that way and think of something as a missed opportunity. But I would never, Mint is the best thing I ever did in my life other than my 2 girls. So I call it my third child, right? Yeah. So I would never trade that for any amount of like potential. I would have made more money had I stayed opportunities. Right. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't want to make it seem like these things are all very seamless and choices you make always work out well. Sometimes they come with some consequences.
Well, that's great. It's an admirable experience, and I hats off to you. On the restricted stock units, my comment is you should have consulted me, and maybe would have had a different acceleration clause, and maybe.
But I remember I quit. So right, it was my call to walk away.
Right, but quit on a not a good reason. But anyway, that's for another time. But no, this is fantastic. I want to shift a little bit to a different subject. Given that our audience on this call and later is primarily IRMA or connected with IRMA, I think it'll be great for our audience to know, both in terms of academics and non-academics, what role did IRMA play in your professional and personal growth? I know you mentioned we became adults, we entered boys and girls at IRMA, and then when we left, we were adults. But uh, when you look back, how successful you have been in your profession, do you ever go back and think about, how did IRMA influence all this, and what was the role it played? And like to get your thoughts on that.
My mom, she died a couple of years ago, would tell you that um, up until he went to Irma, he would refuse to eat a bunch of food. And then after Irma, he would eat like literally everything I cooked, right? Because um,
Don't we all?
between the watery dal and everything else that Irma, the mess offered up, you
Mm,
became a lot more like open to the idea of like, practically consuming anything. Anyway, that's
right,
it's a
right.
bit of an aside. Look, a few things, right? One is that Irma was, I don't know if it is now, but at that time, very, very clear about where you stood in everything, right? I mean, the list of when you got there the first day, they would give you a list of all your batchmates, right? Remember that document they gave?
Yep.
And you were ranked where you were based on your performance in the entry, right? So I was like out of a batch of, I think we were 63 or 64. I
Mm-hmm.
was in the 40s, right? And I was there for math remedial, by the way, right? So they clearly told you like, well, there are like 40 people who are much better than you when you came into this class, right? So I think whether it was conscious or not on part of Irma, I think they really made you realize that like you thought you were like whatever amazing, but like not so, right? Relative to even your own peers. So I think they perhaps unintentionally, they kind of really create that sense of like healthy competition, I think, which I later realized that that's what happened in Irma. And and in my case, like I said, I was in the like 40s or something in terms of the ranking of our incoming class. And 2 years later, when I graduated, I think I was the sixth in terms of the GPA. And again, the IRMA makes it very clear where you stand, right?
Sure.
So just that ability to say that, look, I can actually significantly improve my performance was, I think, something I never thought about in up until that moment, right? So I think it was a good
Interesting.
like self-realization. Two, I think some of the courses that we took, whether it's Professor Raja's Mac class or things like that, for the first time in my life made me apply something to real life or a case or like a very practical solution, right? And that was a big turning point because up until then, I went to Nizam College in Usmania University in Hyderabad, BA in economics, geography, and sociology. But essentially, the same 15 questions were always asked in the exam. And if you knew the answer to that, you did well, right? You
Right.
didn't fundamentally apply anything you learned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this was the first time that you realized the value of like taking something like that and applying. Like I said, I went in for math remedials, right? Professor Shenoy was the professor at that time. It was tough, but it also did one thing that it helped me overcome my fear of things, right? I was not great at math by the end of it, but I was pretty good at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that something that you thought you didn't do well or you feared something. So I think in many ways, Irma really made me believe in myself a lot more. It made me a lot more confident about just dealing with uncertainty. I think that was the fundamental skill I learned from Irma. And also, I mean, most of us came from in my case, Hyderabad. Even though I had friends, my best friends growing up in Hyderabad one was a Sikh, one was a Rajasthani, one was like a Gujarati, and one was a Muslim. So Hyderabad had that like multicultural dimension.
Mm-hmm.
But making us live together for 2 years and all of us from different parts, I think made us a lot more open and flexible about like di the differences among us. And I think has fundamentally been a value that I have uh, applied very successfully. I remember going to Wall Street Journal Europe, my first meeting, looking at a room full of people and saying, boy, these are all like white people, right? Because they were. But then, like literally in like a week, I realized huge differences between managing a German versus managing a French person versus managing a Belgian versus managing a Brit, right? So, and then being able to do it well, right? Not kind of paint them as like all white people and we need more diversity of a different kind, but to say there is actually a lot of diversity in my team, right? And each one brings a very complex cultural baggage and all of that. I think all of that appreciation came from IRMA, no question about it. And finally, something that I think we underestimate, Rajneesh, um, I think after IRMA, I have a few good friends that I made, but all my friends are from before IRMA and at IRMA, right? My closest friends. You are one of them. There are others on this call as well. And the value of that is pretty astonishing, right? Sometimes as a professional network, sometimes as a sounding board, we have talked about very personal family things. We've like talked about professional things. We've sounded, our kids are now like in cities where we are helping them, other people's kids to kind of find apartments and jobs and things like that. I think that relationships that we have built as is amazing. I mean, for those who are not from our batch, 51 out of our 63 colleagues are on a WhatsApp group today, literally an active WhatsApp group where we communicate every day, right? That's a astounding thing when we are about to, next year will be the 40th year since we all first became friends at IRMA, right?
Right.
So there is huge, huge value to that. And I am forever grateful for what IRMA has meant in my life.
That's great, Raju. A lot of these things resonate. It's amazing. And I am sure the audience today and those who listen to this will probably agree with your observations. This is fantastic. Um, a bit off topic question. Given your various roles, mostly leadership in recent years, uh, can you share with this audience some common principles, traits that you follow being a leader? You've moved from one organization to another in leadership roles, dealing with different groups of people, different sets of circumstances. But what are one or two things that you have adhered to in executing your leadership responsibilities as you move from one opportunity to the other that you have found beneficial?
So I think fairly early on, I kind of realized that I actually like managing people, right? I mean, typically it comes with like, sometimes you're good at what you're doing and you get promoted and suddenly you have people to manage, right? Nobody teaches you how to do it in most organizations. And then you end up making a bit of a hash of it, right? So I think just realizing or appreciating the fact that managing people is a real privilege. And oftentimes, when you become a new manager, you still want to be an individual contributor because that's what you do very well. And you treat the managing part of it as like a thing you have to get over with, right? God, I have to deal with this problem of one of my, employees, right? I actually realized very fairly quickly that I actually like it. I like, I mean, I may not be a great manager. That's up to other people to answer that question. But what that realization meant was that this acknowledgement that if you're a manager, that is the job. Other people is your job, not what you can do. I'll give you an example. I'm a big believer in like to-do lists. It's just my nature. Also, I'm getting old. I forget things, so I might as well write them down, right? But I've done this for a very long time. And I have like, even today, I have like a notebook and I write down a bunch of things to do. When I became CEO of the Gizmodo Media Group, right? First time I was CEO. The organization was maybe about 200 people. It was part of a larger company, but very independently run, and I had like all the P&L and other responsibilities. I would go into my job every day, and I would have a list of things that I would write down because I like doing lists. And I would find by the end of the day, by the end of the week, I have scratched off maybe 2 things off the list, right? And I was getting in the beginning, I was getting increasingly frustrated, saying that I'm really failing at this job because I'm not able to do anything, getting anything done. So I reached out to a couple of mentors, and I was kind of talking about that. Um, and they said, like, but why is that? And I said, well, I have an open door policy. And literally from morning to evening, somebody is walking in and we're dealing with some issue and I'm dealing with it. And before I know, the day is over. And very rarely am I able to get anything done on my list, right? And this person said, but Raju, that is your job. Your job is to deal with other people's problems as CEO. And if after that you can get 1 or 2 things of your own things done, you should consider that as an accomplishment and not as a sense of failure, right? And it was it was a fairly revelatory thing at that time. And all of a sudden I realized, you know what, that's it. That is the job, right? I'm being asked to manage other people's lives and livelihoods. And if I solve for that first, all my own individual contributions can come later. So that became a really essential principle. My team will tell you that anything they email me gets responded to literally in like minutes, because I prioritize responding to my team's questions no matter what I'm doing. Often that means that they also get emails from me at like 4 a.m. because that's when I'm up. But though anybody who gets an email from me knows that at the bottom of that, there's a thing that says that my working hours may not be yours. So please don't feel like you have to respond to my timetable, respond to when it's your working hours, right? Because I made that very explicit after I realized people were freaking out. They would log in and they would find that there are 4 emails from me at 4 a.m. And they'd be like, oh my God, the boss must think that like I'm ignoring him. And they would panic. And I would like, okay, I need to explicitly state this, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's something. The other thing that I've learned, and this happens quite a bit in journalism, people tend to move around in journalism quite a bit, right? So at the beginning, I would get very upset that people I have trained and hired and built are leaving me, right? I would take it very personally. छोड़ के जा रहे हैं, मतलब they're like abandoning this organization. What did I do wrong? What did we do wrong? Then I realized that like, if you change your mindset about this and you kind of say, the people I've hired or discovered or mentored and trained and given opportunities, what have they gone on to do in their lives? And if you look at that as like a reflection of your contribution to that, then it changes your mindset about people leaving you. You actually encourage it. You tell them like, great opportunity. How can I help you like succeed? Yeah. Can I be a reference? So what I tell my people is that like, make sure that you evaluate the opportunities get to you, but don't come and tell me to counter something when you at the end. Tell me at the beginning so we can talk about like what that opportunity is. Sometimes I've told people, you know what, you should take this. So I think having that mindset about how you measure your self-worth as a manager and as a leader, if that becomes a bit more expansive, that has also been something that has been good for me. And then hiring is something that I particularly look, managers can delegate everything except the hiring bit, I think. So I don't get involved in like early preliminary screening. I have a 100% team now at McKinsey. There is nobody who gets hired till they have a final conversation with me, because I feel like that's the most important thing. Not because I have veto powers. I don't often. My team, I don't say hire or no hire. I just say, here is my impression of that person, and they can make the choice. And sometimes they hire somebody that I may not necessarily give high marks. But the reason I do it is that they are coming into my team. I'm responsible for them. They need to know me and ask me questions upfront, and I need to get to know them. So I think having that commitment to hiring everybody and knowing them and getting to know them, I think is also something I've practiced over a long period of time. But the bottom line is like really believing this idea that like my job is managing people and their lives and livelihoods, and everything else I can do if I have time has been a good way to do it. It's also been it's also, I think, the biggest challenge I have, I don't know if others feel that way, is really this tension between being a microscope and a telescope, right? And by that, I mean, you need to be there for the organization for strategic direction, right? You can't be absent from that.
Right.
But you also need to care enough about execution, but do it in a way that you don't become a micromanager, right? So that balance is very hard. And I'm very conscious of like, am I being a microscope or a telescope? And how do I balance it without being a micromanager or being AWOL? Some leaders are AWOL, right? You're like, they're never there when you want them, right? So I've constantly struggled, but at least I have a self-awareness that that's a struggle that I need to constantly make sure that I'm not over-indexing to one or the other.
Great skills, Raju. I'm sure there's a lot to learn here. I'm also looking at the time. I have one last question before we turn it over to the audience if they have any questions. This question is inspired from a book, Raju, that I read that you recommended, Being Mortal.
Mm.
And I came across a hypothesis of one of the scholars mentioned in the book, Professor Laura Carstensen. She tested a hypothesis which reads, how we seek to spend our time may depend upon how much time we perceive ourselves to have. Fascinating quote, although it was in the context of health and personal goodwill. Going back to your comment earlier, you've spent almost 4 decades in this profession. I have no idea what your future plans are, how many years you plan to work. But if this was the way to measure, uh, how will you see, or what factors will you consider as you navigate the remainder of your professional career? What will influence your decisions for the remainder of what you have in mind or what you wish to do in your profession?
Look, I mean, we can turn our life into a victory lap, or we can go back to work, right? So I think it's a fairly simple thing for me, which is like, and it ties into my approach, Rajneesh, which is, if you think of your career as a ladder, right, and you're climbing, there'll come a point when somebody above you has to fall off, or you have to leapfrog them to keep climbing, and all ladders reach a kind of an end, if you will. But if you think of it as a portfolio of interesting experiences to collect, and it's much more horizontal, then it's a fairly, I would say, endless career, right? Look, I am very envious of, we all know some of our classmates from our PRM 6 batch are fully retired, at least from, their jobs, and are happy, like, just like, doing other things, playing golf and other things, and watching their kids and their grandkids. And nothing absolutely wrong. I'm sometimes envious of that life. In my case, I don't ever see not working. I may not be working for a paycheck. If I reach a point where I don't need to pay for my very expensive college for my two daughters, who are both in college right now. And I mean, I've been in a journalism career for most of my life. While it is at big glamorous organizations, journalism doesn't really pay that well in the US. So it's not like I've accumulated a lot of wealth to consider retiring in that sense. But I just feel like, I think I said earlier, I'm like 58 now. I feel like I have another 15 years of very productive, interesting things to do and contribute. So the idea of retirement is not how I would think of the next decade and a half. I would think of it more as like, are there more reinventions left, right? And if somebody seeks my accumulated experience and whatever little wisdom I have and has a problem to solve, and I think I can help with that, I probably would want to take that on, right? The flip side of kids growing up is you also are no longer geographically tied to a location,
Right.
as sometimes you tend to be. So in fact, it feels the opposite of like you have a lot more choices that you could make that you couldn't when you had a younger family, if you will. But the basic question that I ask won't change, right? Which is that, again, if something interesting is out there, you know, when is the last time I did something for the first time? And if it feels like it's something that I would learn from while also contributing to it, I might raise my hand for it.
Fantastic. Look, I am looking forward to see what the next 15 years have in store. It's been a great ride watching you, and I'm sure there are many, many interesting things to follow. Um, I do want to switch over to see if the audience on this session have questions. I'm looking at our chat box, Raju, which I think you also have. We have a couple of questions here. Um, the first question here is from Anand.
Sure,
Uh,
I can.
yeah, so you want
Hey,
to just, yeah.
yeah, Anand, before I answer, what batch are you so that I have some context? You can say it or you can type it, but okay, while you're doing that. I, sorry, Anand, what was it?
Raju, I am 15th batch. Did 1 year with NDDB, and currently I'm as a general manager with the Reserve Bank of India. So I have a team. I'm doing policy. So I have a team, all excellent, all IIT IIM grads, excellent in their work. So I need to give them. I find I need to give them a very long leash to deliver and be very uh, uh, defensive when it comes to strict deadlines, because they'll come out and saying, boss, it needs more research, please let us ask for more time. So that's where I'm coming from in phrasing the question.
Fair point. And also, by the way, R. Subramaniam from our batch, who just retired from RBI as I think a deputy governor. If you don't know him, you should get to know him. He might also be useful in terms of giving you some.
We have been together in markets department. He had at one point in time been chief dealer in Department of External Affairs, DEIO. And that time I was a dealer dealing in USD INR interventions.
Right, but
So
I meant like
together.
I meant more like if you want to reach out to him to get some thoughts on how to like do what you're asking, it might be more contextual. I'll give you a couple of generalized answers here, Anand. One is that I think you have got to acknowledge that not everybody in the team needs to be in the same place for the team to move forward, meaning that not everybody has to fully buy into what you're trying to do there. Some people will be behind, some people will be ahead, as long as they have an understanding that why is it that we are trying to, hit a deadline, or why is it that, what is it that we are trying to do? Two, I think you should be pretty open about the constraints, meaning that sometimes the deadlines you set are not dictated by you, they're dictated by other people wanting something in a particular period of time. And I think the team needs to understand that. I would apply, I think, some lessons from, I work a lot with tech teams. I would apply lessons from like having, tech teams are pretty good at like, um, being agile and kind of having regular check-ins with a very structured way. So if a deadline is 3 months away, rather than come up to it a week before and then hear your team members very legitimately, by the way, say we need more research or we have certain things, if only we had that, we would make for a more complete report. It's a valid point, but perhaps like having multiple check-ins very early on might be another way to go. And then finally, I think a lot of us tend to be of this, look for perfection as the result. I'm not necessarily sure that these are all life or death reports and decisions. So it's fine sometimes to not kind of have something be completely perfect, as long as it's solving for the question. So willingness to say that, look, had we had more time, this would have been even better, but it's valid, it's directionally the right thing to say. And if after this, if you give us more time, we will improve on this, maybe the way to do it, rather than kind of say that there could always be a project where there is something missing that makes the validity of whatever work has been done to be not particularly sound. And then being open about it is good. But I think it probably has little to do with like their competence. It just has to do with also sometimes maybe some of the work habits could be a bit more structured. You'll always find a couple of people who are very good at what they do, but also tend to be procrastinators, right? So if you understand that and take early action, that might help you kind of manage the set of people. I have found that like most team members are, especially when it comes to deadlines, are much more willing to understand if they feel like their manager has their back and is very transparent about why we need to do some certain things. But if somebody is a chronic, deadline abuser, then you know what you need to do there, right? Because that is causing problems for the team and for yourself. So again, it's a little tricky to answer that in your specific context, but generally that's what I would do. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, are my deadlines realistic or unrealistic? It's possible that occasionally you set, look, all good managers set some unrealistic deadlines, right? Because sometimes that's the need. And maybe from now on, if a deadline is X, maybe you do an X minus as the deadline to give yourself some cushion. So be careful about that, because if you're doing that every time, then people know that like the deadline is not the real deadline.
Yeah, in most of the cases, the deadline is known to the team because it flows in a hierarchy and a bureaucracy like Reserve Bank. It flows and the team entirely knows it all. So the deadlines are like wherever we haggle, it's all between the milestones in between. And but that response is useful. Thank you.
Great.
Great. Thank you. Raju, we have one more question from Nidhi. Probably it's about how do you motivate yourself. So you want to take that question?
Yeah, I'm looking at the question. So I think, Nidhi, some of it could be that I was doomed by DNA, in the sense that my mom. So I grew up in we were a lower middle class family in Hyderabad. My mom was a English teacher who later eventually became an English literature professor. My dad, had a PhD in philosophy, no good for any career, but interesting subject for him to do, and then was a journalist. So we grew up with this notion that like education was the only way out of anything. So that I think ingrained some interesting values in me, but also fundamentally gave me this notion that like I shouldn't do things for financial reasons, right? Maybe it's a self-justification for not having enough money, but I haven't made any decisions in my life that were purely about finances, sometimes much to my detriment. But that allows you, it frees you up to kind of make some interesting career choices, geographic choices, and accumulate some learning experiences. So it's possible that a lot of that has actually made me much more open to it. But I've also been very, I would call myself as like a couple of inches deep and a mile wide, meaning that there is literally no topic that anybody wants to talk that I actually not know a little bit or be able to engage in a conversation. But I have preferred like horizontal breadth over vertical expertise. And that has, I think, also helped me be much more open to trying new things rather than saying, I have a CFA, I've built all this expertise, and that's what I want to do all the time, right? It's perfectly valid, no issues about it, but potentially limits like your ability to, or your risk-taking ability. If somebody says, great CFA, but we want you to be our CIO, and you're like, shit, I don't know anything about that, right? In my case, because I don't know anything about anything most of the time, I'm probably much more willing to kind of say, how hard can it be? Let me go try it. And one thing that has helped me is that in journalism, at least in the West, there is this notion of church and state, meaning that you don't mix the business side of journalism with the journalistic side of journalism. So a lot of people just go up on one side all their lives, right? But very quickly, because maybe perhaps of my business background, because of IRMA and my interest in business, I was always very mentally attuned to kind of being much more friendly to the business side of journalism. So when opportunities came up that were at the intersection of journalism and product and tech and content and strategy, most people would be like, oh, those jobs are the worst jobs because you're definitely set up for failure in a church and state environment. I would always be kind of saying, sure, let me try it, right? And so as a result, I became one of the early people who in the Western journalism world who had experience in journalism, but also all of the digital stuff. So it opened up the doors to more opportunities. People would say, who do we know who has transformed? So I'll give you a very concrete example. Mint, when we launched it in 2007, was the world's first multimedia newsroom. We launched the website before we launched the newspaper. We had a TV studio inside the newspaper. Now it's relatively common, but in 2007, literally nobody in the world had that kind of a model. Newspapers were still print and digital. They were trying to make it work together. So the reason the Washington Post called me was because they were looking around for somebody to combine their print and online businesses. They had kept them separate. They thought it was like too long. And they looked around and they found this guy in India, in Delhi, running a paper called Mint. And they said, that guy seems to know what he's doing. Let's call him, even though it was the Washington Post, right? So the willingness to want to try new things and take risks, I think, was also helpful. So all of that have added up to kind of giving me more opportunities.
Great. Thanks, Raju.
Thank
Raju,
you.
Do we have time for one last question or?
Yeah, Rajneesh, I have time. I'm happy to, hang around and answer more questions
Sure.
as well. How about
Okay.
you? I don't want to impose it on you.
No, I'm fine. I just want to make sure timing is not an issue. So there is a question from Mahavir from PRM 21. He wants to know your views on the quality of people. Specifically, he says the quality of people he hears has constantly been going down. It's not been the same as 15 years ago. How do you see things?
Mahavir, nostalgia is a bad curator because there's no fact checking for nostalgia. Meaning that every generation feels like back then things were amazing. We will all tell you that IRMA has gone down the tubes since we all graduated, right? We'll tell future batches that, right? Yeah. So I would be very careful about this like sweeping nostalgic golden years view of anything. Honestly, for some of us, and if my friend Ranjani was on this call, she would tell you the worst manager she ever dealt with was in the first year of APDDCF in 1987, right? So there's never been a time when managers have been amazing, and there've never been a time when they have sucked at uniformly. So I would like kind of push back on that notion. There is some truth to the fact that the proliferation of business schools in India, especially for-profit schools, has meant like a lot more people with an on-paper MBA who really, that paper is not worth anything, right? That degree. So I think you have to be careful in like assessing people when you hire. And for example, one of the questions I always ask in interviews is, what is the last new thing you learned? You'd be surprised at the number of people who cannot answer that question, right? So I think it's those kind of things are what you need to do to evaluate somebody whether they're good rather than just their technical skills, resume, and all of that. Because what I'm looking for is this learning mindset, right? And if somebody can't even tell me something new they have learned over whatever period of time, right? It could be anything. And they're struggling to answer that question, I tend to kind of get a little worried about them because my team, we are constantly innovating. So being able to do new things is very critical. Doing them well is critical. So you need to have all the fundamental skills. So I think there are ways to evaluate people, especially if you are the manager and trying to assess people and how good they might be as a manager.
Perfect. No, thanks. Thanks, Raju.
Do we have any other questions from those who are on the call with us?
Yeah, I have a question. And this is kind of a personal struggle. It's been a personal struggle for a long time. I know IRMA you do an MBA, but since then I went on to do something else that moved a little beyond. I got a lot more technical rather than just management and being broader. And it's this ongoing struggle of, what do I want? Do I want to grow as a manager, as a leader? Or do I really want to dig into the technical work because that gives me joy? So I wonder if you have faced those struggles. I know you went through IRMA, you worked at AP, and you went into the whole career of journalism, and then it's moved on to something else, and you're dabbling in all kinds of things. Do you miss the heart and soul of journalism?
Yeah, so Samya, it's an interesting question, right? Because I went into journalism for a couple of reasons. One was like, I was sitting in Ahmedabad for AP Dairy in the home of Amul, trying to sell Vijaya products, right? So it was like fun, but also interesting, challenging. The way success was defined was how many trucks of cheese and butter and ghee you sold in any period, right? Against Amul. And at some point I was like, this is not how I want to measure my life in the future. I could get very good at it. I was not bad at it. I was okay. And so I kind of said, okay, what gave me joy? And I remember, like, as a young kid, I would dash off letters to the editor, to Deccan Chronicle and Indian Express, and they would get published, and I would get a great thrill about, like, something I think that I'm sharing is out there for other people to read, right? So then I kind of said, okay, that's what I want to do. I was pretty decent in English and all of that and communications. So the fundamental reason I went into journalism was I love reporting, meaning that I love looking at something, asking questions, and explaining that to a wider audience. I was never a good writer. I was an okay writer. And so writing, to me, the byline, right? Something with your name, was a way to get my reporting out of the way so that I can report again. So that, I would say, my fundamental strength is, and it's a managerial principle now, I am extremely curious. I'm always asking why, and I'm always kind of saying, why? What if we do something differently? Why should the status quo be the only way to go? So if that is what gives me joy, the fact that I'm not applying it to journalism in a news context doesn't particularly bother me anymore, because I have done that, right? I've had enough bylines to last a lifetime. I don't need one more Raju Narisetti on top of an article. But the basic reasons that have motivated me and kind of given me joy absolutely continue, right? I mean, my team will tell you, he's constantly asking us, if we did something this way last year, why aren't we improving it this year, right? So I think each of us has to discover what that is that gives us joy. I'm speaking for, I think Meenu had to drop off, but if I'm speaking for Meenu Vadera on my call, I think I've realized in knowing her over the years, empowering women is the bottom line for her. Where she has applied that has changed over time, right? But I think that's what gives her joy, seeing women get better at everything. I'm sure each one of us can identify that. So Soumya, you've been very successful. You and I have known each other from the time I was in DC. Where I think you have to make a choice is, I think there's nothing absolutely wrong in being an individual contributor. In journalism, some people are reporters for 40 years and retire as reporters, right? That's what they like. They don't want to manage people. And that's totally fine. Sometimes it comes with a cost, right? You don't maybe necessarily move up in the hierarchy of an organization. But moving up in the hierarchy of an organization is not what gives you joy. It's the reporting that gives you joy. Then you're in a good place, right? So I think that's a question we have to answer. At McKinsey, there is a principle called make your own McKinsey. The idea being that there's McKinsey, the organization, but what is your McKinsey? And in my case, and I get asked all the time this question about, you're a journalist, now you're at McKinsey. McKinsey has a great reputation, but also has some question marks about some things they have done. Why are you there? And I usually answer it in 3 ways, right? One is that it pays the bills, right? Obviously, that's important. All of us need to make a livelihood. I absolutely love the team that I work for. I've hired about 70% of them over the last 5 years. Every day I feel like this is a team I enjoy working for. So there are other parts of McKinsey I may not enjoy that much. I may have challenges, but this is my make your own McKinsey. And honestly, I'm very good at it, right? So if all 3 add up, then I'm like, you know what? That's my McKinsey. And so I think you have to ask yourself some of those questions and be willing to give up some things that the world seems to care about, seem to be important, but may not be the real motivating factors for you. I know I'm speaking a little bit in the abstract. I generally try not to be very prescriptive when it comes to career questions, because it's such a personal choice that we make, and our circumstances are, for every one of us, is slightly different.
No, I totally agree. And I like what I'm doing. But every once in a while, I look at people within my teams like they're doing the really interesting work. Sometimes I wish I could get my feet wet and do it, but I don't have the time. I don't have the ability, and my role is different. And my skills are used just in a very different kind of way. My skills are still important, just used in a very different way. Sometimes I miss it. So it's that balance that it's an ongoing struggle.
And Soumya, you can actually make room for that. One of the nice things about being the boss or being a manager is you control your time much more than anybody else tells you how to do it, right? So in my case, I'll give you 2 specific examples. We do a series called Author Talks, where we talk to authors of new books. I came up with the idea. In the beginning, I did a lot of them, and then the team started doing it. We do 1 a week, right? I make time every year. I probably do about 20 of them, meaning that I read 20 books. I tell the team to put me in on the calendar for this, and I do them, right? And I get no credit for it, meaning that if I didn't do them, nobody would say, why is Raju not doing Author Talks? But I do it because I like doing it, right? So the question really for us is like, is that something that you want to do and you want to make time? And my team is happy because I'm helping with the workload, right? But at the same time, it makes me feel happy because that's where I'm an individual contributor. Again, I'm not doing it for Raju's byline on that piece. I'm just doing it because I like reading books. And by the way, it forces me to read more books than I normally would make time for. So I think there are ways you can say, hey, I'm going to pick up this project, and it can't be big footing, right? You can't take it away from somebody and make them feel like you're stepping in on their toes. But if you're very upfront about like, I'm going to give 10, 15% of my time to do some individual contribution things, but it won't come at the cost of managing my team. I will always be available. I will prioritize that, but I will make time to do these other things. I think that may be one way for you to kind of solve for it. There are times when organizations like, I think Google and others are much better at this, that give sabbaticals for people to kind of take some time off and do some special project. So there could be that route as well. And maybe sometimes, I mean, not in your context, because that's not what the issue seems to be, but sometimes it's finding something outside of work, right? That makes you feel like you've learned something, accomplished something that is like uniquely yours, and it's not like requires you to be a manager all the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions? So let me just make sure. Anyone in the audience? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat box. Raju, I don't know if I'm missing something.
Yeah, Rajneesh, I just want to put there are people here that I don't know personally, but if anybody wants to stay connected, here's my LinkedIn as well.
Great.
I think that was quite an energetic and interesting conversation tonight. I think there's no more questions around, so then we can call it an evening and morning for you guys. And I'll just close the call then.
Yeah, thank you, Ritu. Raju, thank you so much. It was wonderful chatting and learning so much. Despite me knowing you personally for so many years, I learned a lot. Hopefully, the others also enjoyed. Looking forward to more of these conversations and wishing everyone the very best. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank
Rajneesh, I
you
know
so much.
very early in the morning.
you.
Appreciate that. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Rajneesh. Thanks, Raju. Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night. Bye-bye.